sees even my papers.
How to make this work.
I instead tried to just make my notes fit into this thing where I've like abbreviated everything to the point of kind of abstraction, and I'm like,
We should need like your own key.
yeah, I don't really understand what it is anymore. So, yeah.
This feels very official. Well, good afternoon, welcome. My name is Alexandra Landré. I'm artistic director here at Strom. I really have to get used of looking around so I can see everybody. Welcome today for our roundtable discussion as part of our exhibition for More Heat Than Light, a project with Agustina Woodgate. I'm very happy that we can host this context program today. And for those people who are not familiar with Strom, Strom is an organization, an art organization that focuses on the relationship between art and society. And we do explore that together with artists. And in this case, it's a very new exploration with quantum communication, but also all kinds of other topics for today, and also in the project with Agustina. And actually, I'm just going to give a small welcome. And Lua Vollard, my colleague and curator of the show, will guide you through the talk today. Thank you so much, and welcome and enjoy.
Thank you.
Hi. Such a tech intense setup, but also like walking into the round table, you're like, oh my god, we're all here. Yeah, my name is Lua Vollard. We worked on the show together for the past 3 years, and I'm going to be moderating this conversation today. So I'll start with a few household things, very simply. We'll be referring a lot to an exhibition called More Heat Than Light. For those in the space here, it's right there. For those watching at home, you might not have been able to visit yet. The show is still open until the 15th of December. And after the program today, you can also go and have a look around if you haven't yet. Then, second of all, maybe, perhaps, well, for sure, is that today we're going to be in conversation for 90 minutes as a roundtable talk. Very few breaks, so a little bit intense. And what we have not planned for today, it depends a little bit on how the discussion goes, is to take questions from the audience. But if you're here, don't worry, there will be drinks and an opportunity for a more casual discussion afterwards. That being said, 90 minutes is also rather a good sit, a good brain workout, especially to be speaking about quantum themes. So if any of you in this space here want to get up and grab a coffee, go to the bar in the middle, that's absolutely no problem. The bar is right there. Try and do it as quietly as possible, I suppose. That's it for me now. I'm going to do some short introductions of those who are joining us today. We're very glad to have them. First and foremost is Agustina Woodgate, the artist who has made the exhibition. And Agustina is an artist who investigates the poetics and politics of infrastructures. And for the past 3 years, that's meant the infrastructures of quantum communications for More Heat Than Light. So we'll be talking in depth about that. Then we are joined by two of the scientists who've worked on the show. There's Kian van den Enden, van der Enden. A PhD candidate for QTech. QTech is the Dutch Institute for Quantum Computing and Quantum Internet. They were a major partner on this show. And in Kian's research, he works on the first metropolitan scale quantum connection, an experiment of which was undertaken last September. So we'll be showing you a little bit of where that experiment took place. Right next to him is Maria Grazia Giuliano, also a PhD candidate at QTech, where she works on multi-node quantum network and has a specialization in photonics. And what that has meant for us is that when Agustina was spending time in her lab, it would be a lot at the optic table. So a lot of lasers, a lot of lights being shot through different glasses. We'll be speaking, making accessible some of that work today, hopefully. Right next to her is Tomo D. Tomo D is an artist and researcher whose work is focused on examining the political and philosophical implications of techno-scientific practices. And we've invited him today because he's also a research fellow at Connect, which is the Science Foundation Ireland Research Centre for Future Networks and Communications. So you've worked a little bit on the kind of critical reflections on quantum policy that we'll be talking about today. Last but not least, we're joined by Ramon Amaro, who's the senior researcher in digital culture at the New Institute, where he leads -1, which is the hub for digital culture. And we'll be discussing a little bit also your book, The Black Technical Object, Machine Learning and the Aspiration of Black Being, which contemplates the abstruse nature of programming and mathematics and a deep incursion of racial hierarchy to inspire alternative approaches to contemporary algorithmic practice. So linking that a little bit to what that might mean for quantum. Okay, I'm going to switch to some others very soon. We've structured the conversation today into a few subjects, and I will address them sometimes openly, sometimes let the conversation flow a little bit more. So also for you at the table, if you want to respond, just look deeply into my eyes, make sudden movements, grab my attention. That's absolutely welcome, but we've also prepared a few themes that we'll be addressing today. First of which is introducing you all to the exhibition and how it actually relates to quantum communications and quantum developments. We're going to be speaking a little bit about quantum infrastructures and that beautiful root of your experiment that we actually get to see, which I haven't seen yet. We'll address quantum as a way to look at the world, so a new kind of collective imaginary or a new epistemology. Then there's two more, let's say, applied subjects on quantum. So we'll be discussing quantum applications, where is the technology now, how is it actually used, how is it being developed, and also the implications of those developments for geopolitics. So what are the kind of political movements around this technology? And ending, perhaps, maybe we're already far over time with these subjects, but ending on the kind of future of quantum computing. Okay, I'll start. This is like exciting for me because I do a lot of tours of this exhibition, and the first thing I say to people who visit the tour is, this is not an exhibition about quantum communications. This is not a scientific display, but today we really get to nerd out about it. So maybe the thing I wanted to open it up with is, from all that research that you've done in quantum, Augustina, we arrived to a place where the show is called More Heat Than Light, and temperature actually becomes the regulator to the infrastructure of this exhibition. How did you make that jump?
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, first and foremost, for being here and for sitting around, hopefully, for some of these conversations and our nerding out. So temperature is the regulator of the communication system that is occurring inside the gallery space. And perhaps it's relevant to then address that in my practice, when I set up exhibitions, I also set up functional experiments. So they are infrastructures, and they are actually alive. I typically don't know. They are experiments. I don't know necessarily what the outcome will be. I have certain parameters of what may happen, but once the exhibition opens, then the experiment begins, and that is really, for me, the exhibition, is that setup of the experiment. These experiments are provocations that uncover the ways things and resources circulate. And this is at the center of my practice. The dynamics, the logics, and the emergent properties of circulation. So that said, because these experiments are functional, time becomes of essence. And it's always a major consideration. And then I would make a direct link between temperature and time. So just to bring some science, there is an irreversible, between the relationship between temperature and time lies the irreversible nature of thermodynamic processes, such as changes in a system, cycles in a system, and the flow processes. So every time there is a difference in temperature, heat is involved, which means temperature then is involved. So in this occasion, I would consider temperature to be the clock of this experiment. When I first visited Maria Gracia and Kian's lab, we discussed right off in the very first meeting materiality. And imperfect diamonds and quantum particles were, of course, at the center of the conversation. The quest in the lab is to maintain a quantum state in the quantum state of these particles. These particles are the smallest particles. I'll simplify some things, you guys, of course, jump in. But there are the smallest particles in the universe, right? Like photons, electrons are examples of them. And they have a specific property, which is they are in a quantum state, which we will unpack as we go in these 90 minutes. But in order to keep this quantum state, a few conditions are considered and regulated and controlled in extreme precision. And one of these conditions is temperature. Noise interference, light interference, there's a few, but temperature really calls my attention for two specific reasons. These imperfect diamonds that are the stars of the show require to be at almost absolute zero temperature. This transfers to minus 273 degrees Celsius. This is a temperature that doesn't exist anywhere in the universe, except in their labs, synthetically produced. And these diamonds, as I said, they are imperfect diamonds. They are not gems that they are collecting from nature. They are also producing these diamonds inside the lab. They are growing them at 1,000 degrees temperature in only 3 weeks. And it takes about 1 to 3 billion years for the Earth to produce diamonds naturally. So, of course, I was completely blown away by the capacities to defy geological time and create such artificiality in their conditions. So then I extracted temperature and made it also my condition in this experiment that we're setting up. So this experiment is running on temperature, depends on temperature, and the variations in temperature affect your experience, but also you entering the exhibition are affecting the information that's being processed. So this temperature, such it is in our experiment as it is in the lab, it conceals, it has the power to conceal the information or the experiment, but it also enables the communication flow. So maybe I'll finish this with a note that I wrote when thinking about this, is that if we consider time to be an emergent property that is closely related to thermal interactions, without these thermal differences, meaning without temperature, our senses of time, direction, and flow would be profoundly affected.
I'm personally still sort of working through that sentence in a way it relates to, having your body in this space and having your body being heated up and that producing certain outcomes. I'm curious to talk a little bit about this notion of functional experiment, because for us as an arts institution, it's like very much the first time that we would have, anything that counts as an experiment during opening hours, in our exhibition space. But of course, for Maria Grazia and Kian, you're in the line of work of experiments every day, right? And I was wondering, in the run-up to this exhibition and working with Augustina in the lab, maybe Maria Grazia, could you say something about what was it like to have an artist kind of enter into your world?
Yeah, that's a nice question, and I also take the opportunity to thank you for this invitation and also for the for letting us to join this marvelous work. What I really, really enjoyed about this collaboration is the fact that for me, all these things, temperature, time, are something ordinary in my everyday life, because it's something that I have to deal with every day. But for the first time when I walked into the exhibition, I was able to grasp the beauty behind it, because when you have to work with it, at some point you also start hating it, right? Because you're like, okay, why is this not working? Why I not achieving what I want? But I think the exhibition, at least for my perspective, is a way for finding the beauty also in something that is so cold, if we want to use temperature-related words. But at the same time, what I really love about that is that for people that are not from the field, walking into the exhibition is also a way to understand what is behind these new emerging technologies, because it's not just behind, there's not just the hype of we're going to have new technology, new ways of communicating. But it's also a way to learn how difficult it is to achieve such goals, and that there's still a lot to do. And and it can also be a beautiful journey towards these technologies.
Kian, was this experience the same for you? You know, really seeing the beauty of your work reflected, or what was your immediate, or what was your response to that exhibition?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I think indeed it's that view of having someone outside looking in. It's indeed that sort of, having to reassess and sort of let your face be put into things that normally pass you by every day, and it indeed becomes sort of almost I don't want to say a drag, obviously, but indeed you take it for granted, like what is happening all around you. And then, of course, sometimes it's even different if you have technical visitors, right? Because they are also interested in the tech, but they understand perhaps, they have like a different mode of understanding, have a different context. So the questions will be different, and you get back into this sort of technical professional mode. And when Augustina comes in, then all of a sudden it's like, wait, why is this color? Or why is they make it this sound? Which is questions that you never get otherwise. And I think that indeed helps you re-evaluate also the beauty of what you're doing, but also, I guess, in part, maybe sort of also the complexity and that tether also to how other people outside of that bubble really look at technology from their context. Because, we don't have to do that all the time. Yeah.
I think certainly that quotidianness of the work that you're doing. I think there's a lot of artists in our audience who would recognize themselves in like being so close to something you start to hate it. Actually, right? Yeah.
Just also, I had a moment in our exchanges where it felt like I was almost digging for some things that it was hard, because you take so many things for granted. And for example, I remember when you, like, after 2 years, you show me this one picture of the single photon that you had forgotten yourself. And it's such a beautiful image, as an image, no? In itself, as an image, as a picture. And so then you told me the story about the camera and this and that, and the same thing with the temperature log or things like this, that it felt that for us, this is the kind of material that we need to create visual translations.
Yeah, we didn't even make that link, right? Because for us, that's a tool, indeed, to reach a totally different goal. And I also told you, like, so the context is that at some point you asked, like, because we use and record single particles of light, and you're like, can we look at that somehow? I was like, can we? Like, I think I have like pictures of very long exposure, right? So there's sort of extremely 60-second long exposure time, and constantly you send these single particles of light and you register that, and then in the end you have an image of the representation of what such a single photon could look like in a way. But we use that to assess the performance of our system. So for me, that's like, okay, I take the picture, but then I use it, I move on. And you're like, wait, this is the best picture ever. Like, how could you have hidden this from me all these years? Yeah.
I think what that looked like in our process is at one of the very first meetings with the team, I said, well, Augustina hardly ever makes video, so I don't think there'll be any video. And of course, where we ended up is that there is a kind of necessity of doing some like lens-based practices, because part of your work is in fact a lens-based practice, as we would call it. Yeah. I'm going to leave the lab for a little bit and talk about this experiment, which was actually the backdrop of the work we did, because Kian, you're leading an experiment, this metropolitan scale quantum communications network, whereby a quantum connection was made between a lab in Delft and the KPN radio tower in The Hague. Yeah. Augustina, you ended up cycling the route. Mm-hmm. This experiment is undertaken like through the existing KPN fiber optic cables. So it's an existing infrastructure, and this was of great sort of importance to you. And Augustina, you cycled the route, and I think you had a GoPro strapped to the bike or yourself. We have a sped up video of this that we can look at for a while. Wow.
This is the applied physics building in Delft, indeed. Yeah, you're already looping back. So, if I may, so one of the reasons why the route from one place to another using fibers that are in the ground, right, because these are below where Augustina is biking, are sort of oriented very strangely, because at some point, you have to decide what directionality of your fibers that is in the ground is gonna likely be important in the future, because the fiber I think that we used was maybe even late in the late 90s or the early 2000s. So that's sort of an old fiber track. Usually when new streets are built or when new places are built, because then you have the ability to just lay something in the ground and then build other stuff on top of it. So anyway, those fiber bundles that are in this underground are just crisscross everywhere throughout. But at some point you have to find a way from A to B. And what you then actually do is that you go to these sort of crossing points, and you almost like you sort of reroute the fiber directly, such that you go from maybe one crossing is straight and then the other one is diagonal on top of it, and you make those connections. But that means that there's not a direct line already, right? You already hear and see that you have to go on certain routes that already exist. So that's why this, I think, is so interesting to see that you want to go A to B. The direct distance between our two locations is 10 kilometers, but the fiber route is 25. And it goes loop-de-loop everywhere. Even though this was already the best route we could pick, so yeah.
It's we'll just keep it running in the background for a bit, yeah. Augustina, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the kind of the impact of like this, metropolitan or urban environment on the development of the show, or like you say, when you say you build an infrastructure when you come to make an exhibition, how does this existing infrastructure kind of factor into that work?
Yeah, and I think there are two sort of infrastructures interconnected that are at play here. The context in which this exhibition is taking place, Strom, but also where Strom, the context where Strom is, which is The Hague. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the Netherlands. Infiltrating the infrastructure where the experiment takes place is always my starting point, always. This means that I would have to look into, as I said, the architecture and the landscape, but from different disciplines sometimes. At Strom, I would point out that the exhibition really begins in the library. You can see there's a black line running above in this hallway. And this black pipe goes all the way into a three-phase power group that is inside the library, which I thought it was coincidentally very appropriate, considering that quantum is trapped in academia and research labs. So it was a perfect beginning for the exhibition. So really, without this three-phase group, this exhibition would have had a complete different configuration and certainly a very different kind of materiality. This three-phase group was necessary in order to provide the power to ignite the 6 infrared heaters, radiators that are inside. They are very efficient in terms of energy consumption, but they require a lot of power to ignite. And because they're connected to also sensors that turn them on and off constantly, so there's like this engine that needs to be started quite often and react immediately. So the activation of this three-phase was actually the biggest project in the entire construction of this show. The show opened in September. The activation of that three-phase began in, I would say, March. A bunch of different people had to come see it, electricians, certifies, inspections, more electricians, more inspections, more conversations, the guy from the radiator. And this then starts unpacking a relationship that the institution that will house this exhibition has with its own architecture and with its own infrastructure. And so it brings conversations that sometimes are uncomfortable and that they are complicated, and also uncover things that perhaps one might not want to address, or that just simply didn't know that these were the conditions of its building, of its own skeleton. So this brings to questions like, who is allowed to do this labor? The installer of the show simply cannot help. Then this means that regulations, certifications, permits, inspections come into play. And then automatically this brings the conversation of politics and design. And how is this infrastructure being designed? Why are these decisions the way they are taking and designing our landscapes? And then, in effect, the city looks the way it does for certain reasons. Some of them are for safety, but some of them also are agendas and predispositions, no, that these infrastructures have. So when I found that the experiment that Kian undertook, the metropolitan communication between two imperfect diamonds, literally, one at their lab and the other one at the KPN Tower here in Den Haag, took place using the existing fiber optic infrastructures, then it just simply made sense to also address this conversation specifically on the developments that Quantum was making in the context of Den Haag, in the context of an institution that is called Strom. So it just felt like I was just following the line. Yeah.
Because Strom also means electricity in one of its meaning. Yeah, I realized that we're maybe like. This might be a very quantum way, but we're kind of falling into the middle, because in this conversation, doing a terrible job moderating, we haven't gotten to a definition of quantum communications yet. So I was wondering if Kian or Maria Grazia, if you could do your 1-2 sentence pitch of quantum communications, you know, to some of our audience who might be more like from the arts context. What is it that you do? What are you bringing about?
Thank you. So quantum communication, like in an easy way, I would say that it's gonna become like a tool that it's not replacing what we currently have for communicate. It's not gonna replace classical communication, but rather opening new possibilities by exploiting what is quantum mechanics and the law of quantum physics. And what this will bring is that will bring much safer communication, or can open to a bigger computational power, because suddenly we can make computation using qubits and not bits anymore. So we can.
What is a qubit?
Yes, good question. So a qubit, it's let's say the basic unit of a quantum computation. In classical computation, we have a bit that can be either 0 or 1. A qubit can be 0 and 1 at the same time. This is because quantum physics include the superposition principle, where a particle, an element, a system can be at the same time into different states. And these qubits will become 0 or 1 only in the moment that we observe some particular quantities on that system. And this, of course, can open a new way of making computation.
Kian, could you add something about the very materiality? I've heard Augustina refer to the perfect diamonds a few times, but I'm not sure if we are quite on the same page what they do.
Yeah. So that to tag along, right? So we have, let's say, this theoretical description what bits or qubits are. Now, bits we know because that's in your phone, and sort of we have these billion type of transistors everywhere, right? That is the material version of the bit. At QTech and in the world, we're looking at, what could be different material representations of this quantum bit. I won't go through all of them, but we have many, and one of them is to use a specific imperfection in diamond. And they're sort of, we even call those indeed the defects in diamond. The defect center that we use is something called a nitrogen vacancy center. So we even go deeper, right? Nitrogen vacancy, so now nitrogen's in there, that's another atom. It's an atom that's trapped in the diamond lattice. Diamond is made of carbon, so now we have carbon and nitrogen, and we have actually sort of a hole in there. And this hole we trap an electron, and that's where we're back. So this is the imperfect diamond has an electron trapped, and this electron operates as a quantum bit or as a qubit. And one of the special properties of this thing is that we can get light particles out of this. So we can send light in, we get light back. It's a way of talking to this little thing.
So when we're talking qubits, when we're talking quantum communications, what it comes down to is from your lab in Delft to The Hague, you're sending electrons. We're sending. It's sort of in two steps. It's almost an easy process. We send light to the electron of this imperfect diamond in there. Send light in, we get light back, and we capture that light, and we capture it in this fiber. That's in the ground. So of course it's not in the ground at that moment we capture it, but we capture it, we send it in the ground, and then it goes flying. And this light particle flies all the way indeed then to the place where we do what Maria Grazia said, this observation. So then at some point, we have something called interference. It doesn't really matter, but we do interfere and then we measure. And this measurement is observing what's going on. When we have that, we know that we do that activity. We do this in Delft. And at the same time, exact time, we do this in The Hague. You already see that these two paths sort of meet in the middle. That's where this observation happens. Moment we do that, we know that then the electrons at both Delft and The Hague are entangled. That's the word, entanglement of these two things. That is one thing that sort of quantum mechanics allows us to do, but requires this extreme precision of control of all these things that also Augustina sort of kind of alluded to in the start. And also only a thing that quantum sort of phenomena can show. So there's no classical equivalent of this. Now, when these two are entangled, it means that they're basically part of the same thing. So in a sense, we cannot even talk about these quantum states aren't really distinct anymore. They're kind of melted together, but over a distance, and you can't, touch, feel, whatever is in there. They're entangled over that distance. But that does mean that they're sort of, anything that I do with this quantum state on one end also happens to the other, because now, they're literally sort of part of the same thing. And that's nature phenomena. But luckily, we can use that then to as a sort of, call it indeed a tool in our toolbox to mediate communication between these two quantum bits or these quantum computers. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think
Off
no,
the
that's
deep end, but that's sort of
no. I think that's good. What I wanted to just respond to is that be careful when you speak to an audience of artists and say interference. It doesn't matter. I think there's plenty of us who think of our work as doing productive interference only, exclusively. Yeah.
We've been stopped quite often also by Agustina on certain words and certain sayings, and she's like, no, wait. What did you say 2 sentences ago? Because I'm still stuck on this interference thing. Yeah.
But no, thank you for giving that background on superposition and entanglement, especially because I think that's where I turn on, or that's where a lot of us in the arts kind of turn on, as to the kind of more philosophical possibilities of quantum as well. And I want to open that discussion up to this kind of like new imaginary that quantum can give, especially to the arts, and also open it up to our 2 other guests at the table. Agustina, I'll return to you a little bit later about how those became design principles for the show. But maybe first I'd like to go to Tom, who's joining us from Connect in Ireland. I went to Ireland for a long time and I can't stop saying it in that accent. It's one of my main faults at this point. But maybe you can talk a little bit about how in your work as a research fellow at Connect, you look at the kind of quantum computers in the longer run, or what are they doing for a kind of epistemological shift or providing a new imaginary, especially in that collaboration between scientists and artists?
Yeah. It's I find it always really interesting having this discussion as to how quantum computing works. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about it is quite often we start with this thing and say, well, this is how classical computing works, or classical mechanics works, and it's not like that, and how we're quite bound in this particular notion that we have, and maybe this particular, I suppose, epistemic frame, if we want to think in those terms. And I'm then kind of interested in what you were saying, Agustina, about the exhibition being a functional experiment, because I think, well, what are the things that we also need to know to understand this without having to have reference to this particular frame that we're in? And I think this is one of the big kind of challenges. So, I think technologies can't really be thought of only in technical terms, and in kind of broad, long-term sort of paradigmatic sort of changes. There tends to be a sort of level of agreement, or I came across this term recently, consilience, which is about kind of agreement across different, across disciplines or different frameworks. And I was thinking about how if in Europe maybe 500 years ago we had this kind of framework for kind of legal systems, for political systems, for social systems that were based broadly around this figure of a kind of a spirit or a god figure, which is then replaced in this kind of European Enlightenment or scientific revolution by this idea of a kind of mechanistic, deterministic world in which we have this splitting of kind of subject and object, and the splitting of the thing into these mechanical world that have these properties. And of course, that gives, or maybe not of course, but certainly that seems to give way to also this idea of other kind of ideas of properties, so notion of like rights being attached to an individual, again, like a property, or politically also systems like this, and maybe also, and probably not surprisingly, this splitting also comes to dominate globally through a process of like European colonialism, in which splitting of things from their context also kind of allows this sort of context. So 100 years ago now, we have kind of the development of quantum mechanics, in which this splitting is kind of suddenly more impossible. And I'm interested to think about, well, what else do we need to know? What are the kind of social, political changes that are required for that, and how do we understand them? How do we find them, or where do we find them? And I mean, I noticed in the this, I'm not sure it's the library, but this display of books over here, Karen Barad's book, and she talks, and she's a theoretical physicist, but talking about the kind of inseparability of apparatus and subject, and where else do we find these kind of things? And I suppose to some extent, I think that an understanding of quantum computing, and actually the possibility of, like Maria Grazia mentioned, the potential of a new computer science that's based not on like a binary assumption, but on this kind of potential of a qubit. And we really need to develop, we would need to develop this new computer science, and it needs actually a whole pile of other things to be possible before we can develop this computer science. And that's kind of understandings maybe of I don't know, relationality, of non-binarity, and you know, whether that is happening in the world or not, I don't want to say, I don't know, but I suppose this is kind of what certainly we're interested in, is understanding how this technology both requires and is developed within these other kind of frameworks.
Yeah, I'm trying to. This like opposition between sort of splitting and the possibilities of like superposition that quantum then brings is something I think I want to stick with a little bit as well. Yeah. And it was so this technologies can't only be thought in technological terms. The importance of like thinking cross-disciplinary, and consilience is a term I hadn't heard before. So like super interested. Immediate Google after the program. Yeah. Ramon, I kind of like to take that a little bit further and talk about the black technical object. Very much technologies can't be thought only in technological terms, because you deal in it with the history of algorithms and machine learning, and you argue that these kind of formulas that were set centuries ago are now in motion in terms of like an inscription of racial hierarchies. And I was wondering, you're not an expert on quantum mechanics or communications in any sense, but how has an introduction to this subject kind of changed your thinking, or how can quantum principles such as superposition provide a potential insight into kind of the human emotions behind these kind of laws that are set and how they are in motion now? Yeah.
I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, I will take this quick chance to thank you for having me here. Already enjoying the conversation, and the work particularly is absolutely gorgeous. So thank you for bringing this into the world. I mean, in a way, you know, my work isn't specifically about quantum. You know, I sort of subsume that into high computational systems because, in one sense, a lot of the principles that underpin quantum actually underpin the type of discursive experiment that I'm trying to conduct, and then sort of promoting these type of livable experiments between people in the world. And so what I mean by that is I sort of already starting with the presupposition that we are already operating within a quantum type of reality, that whereby cognitively we try to separate things into these binary categories that we have, but actually when we think psychosocially, even down to the molecular level of how our body actually operates, we're already entangled both with our individual selves as well as the environment that's there. So in a way, you know, my work becomes a sort of epistemic thinking about life as a functional experiment in itself, and then what types of tools that we can have in that toolbox that would allow us to then think through different systems, whether they be computationally driven or, you know, driven by other sort of biological or human types of processes, however we want to delineate that. How that sort of comes into fruition is thinking about, so I'll pick up on the languages that have been set around the table to try to describe the work in itself kind of as an experiment. So in one sense, what I'm implicitly concerned with is thinking about these types of tools, is thinking about them on a psychosocial level. So this would go closer to new experiments within psychology and quantum in itself. And this is based not only on the fact that we are already operating, on the assumption that we're already operating in a type of superposition, which means that, you know, we're in simultaneous spaces, we're in simultaneous times, and it's our sort of perceptions of sociality which then make a coherence that then brings the illusion within ourselves that we're operating at a specific function in time. And then of course that's where power circulates, right? It really circulates within that illusion of placement of space and time, not the necessity of the universal sense of its type of fluidity. And really what it brings me to are the types of processes in everyday life that are, like it was mentioned, sort of taken for granted, and the modes in which we try to understand these processes and then forget that actually many of these processes are innate in how we think about our individual and collective selves to begin with. And so specifically what I'll sort of think about is a lot of my work is thinking about these intersections between racialized logics and computation, right? And I use racialized logics as a general container to think about any form of categorical difference. So we can put gender, we can put sexuality, we can put, you know, I'm left-handed, right-handed, anything you want to, you know, I like this sports team, that, anything you want to sort of put within a category that then affects our own sense of being out in the world. And when we put this sort of collective aspect into a spatial temporal grid, really what we're left with is a set of conditions where some of those conditions are natural and innate, other of those conditions are artificial, in which we're actually operating on a grid of society, both with ourselves and individuals in the collective, and then we spend an extraordinary amount of psychosocial energy thinking about how we regulate both ourselves in that environment and how we regulate a type of sociality. And of course, many of our politics today is really about regulation in an infrastructure. Where does this power get concentrated, and who has the power to regulate, those senses of self? But what I look at in the type of work is thinking about how certain conditions had already been formed that inform how we even think about regulating ourselves in an environment itself. So, if we think about gender, we think about all the sort of social dynamics that condition you before you're born. So before you can walk, you begin to be conditioned in your spatial grid about how you regulate yourself in environments, how others then regulate you. I think this idea of observation becomes very key, because we know with certain social processes like race, gender, these are all constructions that come to life at the moment of observation, not at the moment of reality. So we bring them to life at the moment we say woman, race. And we do this process every sense, and then we take that categorical sense to make sense of our own regulatory mode. And for me, this becomes a type of infrastructure, and then we begin to do these functional modes of how we operate then in society. So I assign to this category, therefore I have this sort of set criteria that has been determined since society began about how I operate. This gives me an indication of how I flow through this structure. I know that this structure is perfect. I know that it's actually synthetic, but there are also spaces in between these pockets in which I can ride the lines of language, almost pointing our own lasers through this sociality, and then think about where my superposition. So in the terms of my work, what this means quite practically on a psychosocial lens is what I begin to do is imagine if one actually has a radical awareness of one's own superposition of themselves within the environment. And if they recognize that superposition in terms of space and time, which means I can be at two simultaneous spaces regardless of the condition, then we can reduce the condition scientifically to background noise. So race becomes noise. It doesn't become the condition in which I operate. But if I'm in a superposition, that means that I can operate as an individual that's racialized and simultaneously operate as an individual that's not racialized. And if I operate in both quantum spaces at the same time, what it allows me to do is pick upon the control. It not only allows me to identify the precise conditions that create racialization in the first place, but it already gives me an innate escape, even cognitively within myself, that brings me out of the category. And that category itself is not dependent upon the conditions in which it unfolds, just like the imperfect diamond, right? The quantum qubit doesn't care that that diamond's imperfect or not. So for me, what I call the black technical object in my work is the qubit. And what I'm trying to imagine is that if we break free of representation and look at the circulation of these types of conditions, and then we understand that the duress that we experience, that we always experience as human beings, actually becomes background noise, what we're left is an empowerment that we become the qubit, and then we, even though we're affected by conditions that might excite us or reduce us, we still maintain the innate properties in a hyperstitional way to project ourselves into a type of future or present that's there. So in a way, it's almost like what we call sort of a hyperstition, where I can actually project myself in space and time to another place, and then I just have to catch up with myself. We do this all the time. I want to be good at yoga. That's a hyperstition. And then you have to just backtrack yourself through the steps in which that are there, and then you encounter the conditions. So I like this sort of fiber routing, right? Because there's no direct condition, there's no direct path between point A of your being and point B of your being in the future or the present, and some of those conditions collide. And what we do in an everyday mode is we're always finding their pathways in which we can actually do the most efficient and operational sense to get myself from one sense of being to another sense of being. And since we're already entangled as individual and collective beings, that means that any shift on an individual level will already impact a collective type of level. So you don't have to over-concentrate on what impact that you have, you just have to move. And then once you move, then it's thinking about how you actually then not actually distract ourselves in terms of sort of politics or racialized logics, and since not distract ourselves that what we actually see is the reality in itself. And the reality in itself is a property that actually is both understood and observed, but at the same time is in excess of what is understood and observed. And so really what I'm promoting in my work is for us to begin to look at that excess as affirmative modes of being and use actually the conditions that create precise synthetic livability as being exactly what it was, made up and synthetic.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where philosophy.
The excess and the noise is exactly is exactly why I was like, interference, don't skip over it. That's the very matter of what some of us might be interested in. Yeah, and I really love this idea of getting to this kind of superposition, the hypostition of the self through problematizing the position of the observer. And one thing I wanted to bring back to you, Augustina, was how that problematizing of the position of the observer, and I think Schrodinger's cat is the kind of, one quantum metaphor that everyone knows, but how that kind of operated in the exhibition, or if you can give some examples of how that operates in the exhibition, some places where it happens, and how quantum became a design principle for the exhibition itself.
So one of the first very meaningful takeaways of my conversations with Kian, in like, I don't know, was, I don't know how long ago, but it was one of the very first things that you told me. Quantum is an interpretation. And I think, speaking to what you two are talking about, it's an interpretation of the world and of the universe. It's different than the one that we are, that we exist in now. And so this interpretation has a few of these principles that both Maria Gracia, Kian, and Ramon had pointed out, duality or superposition being one. So in very physical terms, it means that there is a particle, like, for example, a photon, that is both a particle and a wave at the same time. This is the world they live in. So in the lab, this is quantum. This is the basis of quantum. And what happens is that it's uncertain. They don't know which of the two is. They just know that it is both. For all the artists here, I'm sure this is very poetic, no? That and so in this framework, then the truth is not binary, but is probabilistic and contextual, and this aligns very closely with certain philosophical understandings of knowledge, like you are bringing out, Ramon, here. That is like fluid and contingent and context dependent, and so observation breaks this duality. It collapses it. So in the lab, observation means to measure. But it's the same thing. It's to look at it, to understand it, to take a measure, to point out it. So in the exhibition, for me, this was philosophically very compelling, and it had all these potentials that Ramon is very eloquently speaking towards. And so there are different ways in which I intended to materialize this duality and the complexity of the observer. Perhaps also complicating the presence of the observer. So what happens is, I'll talk about, for example, the first work you walk into the show, Radiations. Symbolically, that piece is addressing to this duality. It has, there are poems written on the glasses, engraved. This poetry is directly speaking towards certain language terminology that we will address a little later, I guess, in the following questions. But you come closer and you uncover as the radiator turns on, then the language, then the text comes forward. So the viewer intends to read, but reading means also burning yourself. So there's a relationship in which you want to read, but you can't. You're not allowed to, or it hurts. You know? The same is the case with Future Star, which is the work that is the thermal printer that is actually the climate log of the experiment. And the moment that a viewer enters the space, it activates an infrared sensor, which then activates a radiator that is right below the thermal paper, concealing the log that was being recorded. So then the same is the case with the difference in temperatures all along the show. Depending on the temperature, it's the videos that are being projected. But then there are cases in which if the temperature is too high, which means that there are a lot of people in the room, because then all the radiators are on for longer time, then the videos also somewhat like go into a glitch, and they have an overlay image that enables you to actually see the visuals. So these are all symbolically playing and speaking towards this observation, but at the same time, this like multiplicity of realities or multiplicity of experiences that you might go through. Then there are more philosophical design logics that were used when creating this circuit, which was, of course, the probabilistic approach instead of the deterministic, and this is straightforward. It is all based on probabilities. There are a lot of videos logged in Alice and Bob, which are two computers that are loaded with all these videos. It's uncertain which videos will play and at what time. And so the whole exhibition is based in probabilities, and it is really an experiment on uncertainty. There was no linearity in the script, but it was more an open space for also assessing this the ambiguity or enabling another. I don't know, multiple ways of being and seeing. Maybe also to address something to Ramon's philosophy, I do want to address the title of the show, which is More Heat Than Light. And it was strictly taken from the title of a book written by Philip Morowski, which is the same title, More Heat Than Light. And this book unpacks the implications of physics in economy and vice versa, observing economy as social physics and physics as nature's economy. And so he believes that economics, in trying to be scientific, has mistakenly applied inappropriate tools to understand human behavior. And so this results in a more heat than light condition in which there is more debate and self-referential theory than actual insight into economic realities. And so is the case with quantum, in a way, no? And like we open up the newspapers and it's like quantum is here tomorrow, it's happening. And then you speak to Kian and Maria Gracia and they tell you, oh, we have at least for another 30 years. So there's also a reality on that.
Yeah. On that, it's a really nice kind of way to start talking about the actual applicability of that tech, because we talk about it in theoretical terms, we talk about it in terms of your experiment. Okay, we were able to send and receive back this qubit. I have a question for Tom, because researching this exhibition, one of the things we found is like, even though QTech is in the Netherlands, there is very little kind of understanding, especially public understanding, of what this technology might mean, right? Which was one of the motivations for us to start working on this exhibition. While at Connect, Tom, you have recently worked on a response to a white paper from the Irish government, who have presented a white paper, so a policy document on what the next 50 years of quantum communications in Ireland?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's on the next, and this is how kind of optimistic it is, it's on the next 6 years of quantum computing in Ireland. So I think, just because there's the presence of a white paper doesn't mean there's necessarily the presence of understanding of the reality. But it is quite interesting, because I think it really speaks to, and this is true, I suppose, not only of quantum computing development, but of all technological development, and it's kind of
Great.
yeah.
Continue in the
but what are the kind of imaginaries that are leading that development? And so if you look at this paper, which says Quantum 2030, it talks a lot about, for example, the impact quantum computing will have in the Irish economy. And we were talking a little bit just beforehand about, again, all this talk about, companies and applications using this thing that as of yet doesn't really in any practical terms exist. And so, while there are, and I think, Cian, you were talking about, successfully doing a metropolitan scale entanglement, this sort of thing, the distance between these sort of experiments happening at absolute zero or almost absolute zero, as Agustina mentioned, and the kind of idea of this technology as something being used and being kind of applied in the world is something where I suppose politics and technology really kind of slip with each other. But for us, what's interesting there, I suppose, is to think then about, well, how do those imaginaries actually shape the development of that technology? So, for example, what stories are being used in the Irish quantum context, but also in the wider quantum context? And so that's why it's kind of interesting to talk here as well and see what the kind of overlaps and differences are. But so part of that is kind of what stories we're telling about it. And actually, along with a colleague, or two colleagues of mine, Haroon Shilyak and Fiona McDermott, we've just started a project which is called Not a Space Race, which, as the name suggests, is kind of understanding the sort of underpinning imaginaries around the development of this. And Haroon really is the leader of this project, so I can't take credit for it, but I can speak a little bit about it. But is thinking about Rancière and the agreement, the idea of the disagreement and the census, to understand not only what stories are we telling about it, and this maybe connects really, I suppose, to the encoded logics from one that you're talking about, but what stories aren't we telling about it, and also whose voices are not being considered valid in this conversation. So it's kind of not only the case that it's about what stories and whose stories tell the kind of future of quantum computing, but also who we tell those stories with. And I think for us that's kind of challenging, because when we talk about what the uses for it are, one of them becomes very much about better privacy, as I think even you mentioned, Maria Grazia. And better privacy is kind of an interesting idea, because what are the kind of bundled assumptions that are required to require better privacy? And one of them, of course, is that someone's going to break your privacy. So we talk about, you hear a lot often about quantum supremacy and this idea of a kind of a race between different powers, military powers, to kind of become either the ones to crack the other person's communications or to secure your own. But even that is underpinned by imaginaries of particular geopolitical orders that, of course, are only maybe 50 or, 100 years old, depending, or, might last for 50 or 100 or 5 days, or who knows. So within that, there are these imaginaries that are required to support this. And this also really, I guess, or maybe to think about how this actually relates to the development of the technology, a useful example that we were talking about recently in Connect was around the blockchain. And when the blockchain kind of, which we don't really hear so much about at the moment, but we were hearing a lot about it a few years ago. And I remember I was teaching briefly kind of technology sort of ethics kind of stuff in a university in Dublin. And one of the subjects was the blockchain. And the kind of description that the students have been given is it's a way of carrying out transactions in a trustless environment. And that was kind of just like taken as read and on we go on. And the first thing I'm kind of wondering is what is this trustless environment and where does it come from? And of course, you know, this technology is developed in the context of kind of California libertarianism, in which there is a direct history to, or a direct connection between the sort of, you know, Wild West colonial expansion and the ideas of like trust of social institutions. And that produces this technology, but in turn, as we can see, the technology then produces also this kind of trustless environment. So this, I think, for quantum computing is also a really important question, that if we build an apparatus that's designed around, for example, ideas of like secrecy or of supremacy, well, what are the potentials then for technologies that we can, or for worlds that we can later build with those technologies? And that, you know, there's a very nice work actually by an artist, an Irish artist called Grace Ware, in which she, it's called Black Square, and it's going to the Atacama Desert to the European Space Observatory to observe the black hole at the center of the universe. And so the whole thing is really about kind of apparatus and the relationship between apparatus and scientific result and technological knowledge. And at the end, the project by the European Space Agency is to, for the first time, take an image of this black hole at the center of the universe. And of course, at the end, they're looking at the screen, a small little screen on a telescope display, and they say, there it is, this is the black hole at the center of the universe, and it's just one black pixel in the middle of the screen. And of course, this technological apparatus produces this thing because it's designed to produce this thing. Yeah. And so it's really impossible to disentangle the result from the apparatus, and this is something I think that's even particularly relevant. And disentangle was a kind of unintentional pun there, but in the context of quantum, this is a, you know, even more relevant way of thinking. So it really is kind of at this moment when the technology is completely nascent and actually quite speculative, important that these are the conversations that we have about it.
Yeah. So you were saying, what are the stories we use to develop these technologies? With whom are we telling these stories? But also, who are the kind of stakeholders here? I think one of the, because supremacy was mentioned a few times, it's also a work that's that's part of the phrase poems in the show. But maybe I want to turn a little bit to Kian, because I know, you know, coming off this quantum experiment, your latest work is a little bit about the ethics of quantum. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit in response to Tom as well, of like, what, you know, how are you working in the lab or as a quantum scientist on like developing who are you telling these stories with?
Yeah, yeah, that's great, because a lot of what Tom says resonates, I think, quite well with let's say, a subsection, at least also of the quantum development ecosystem also that exists in Netherlands and a bit more worldwide. So coming from the corner of, you know, indeed the same thing, you're developing this new technology, it has a bunch of consequences on a technological scale, but that of course seep into, and we call that with ethical, legal, societal, and policy implications going forward. And so what we decided was actually part of it's called we have in the Netherlands we have actually called a Center for Quantum and Society that specifically also, you know, much like sort of Tom, tries to assess, you know, what influence quantum will have on society in all these metrics. And what we wanted to do was specifically for the quantum internet and quantum communication to think about what actually is a desired future for, you know, us, let's say, in the Netherlands or in Europe or even broader, but we wanted to scope it a little bit, of how we would like to see these technologies integrated in society. And as a thought exercise, to place that, we thought about, okay, what would, you know, it's very out there, but what would 2050 look like with this tech implemented? And then we took a bunch of stakeholders from this quantum ecosystem, so that's people from industry, quantum or not industry, quantum or not quantum, from government, from, you know, scientists like me, sort of really put everyone together. What do we want that future to look like? And what I think is a very interesting approach to this is that we wanted to create 4 worlds that are on each corner is an extreme. And so we took 2 axes, right? So you have 4 worlds with 2 axes. Where on one we have that, we talk about the political landscape, and one about how, let's say, how available is quantum technologies. So then you end up with, for example, a corner where you expect let's say, we call that the Western world to go more towards an authoritarian government, for example, right? This is a thought exercise.
This is like the political quadrant meme. I'm imagining it.
Well, almost, right? Yeah, almost.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have like two extremes. So we're going fully democratic world order or fully authoritarian world order. Those are like two. I know it's a bit spicy, but you have to think about it. But because it allows you to emerge these ideas about, what would such a future in that world look like, and is that something we want or not? I feel like you have to address this, because if you don't, you fall back into what you think is what you have already felt you thought, right? And maybe there are things that come out there that maybe are new to you. Now, and the other axis is actually really simple. It's like either we have quantum devices everywhere, which means, as now, right, your phone, everything, it's everywhere, or it's a highly controlled technology that's very centralized. Almost a bit like AI now, right? Because AI now is a very centralized thing. Like, it's very hard to have this distributed everywhere. It's technologically centralized, even though the services are distributed, right? This can also be a difference. Now, so in these four worlds, all these stakeholders were developing these worlds. And, it's very interesting because, like, obviously we're here in democratic society and we want everyone to have say in what's going on. So you already noticed that you have like an innate preference. But what I thought was, what we would develop was these desired future outcomes of what is the perfect world that you hopefully would end up with. And so that was a sort of we did this in several rounds with several of these stakeholders and then tried to come up with this world. And what I then sort of tried to do is assess, like, okay, but that desired future, is that then still in line with what philosophically we call a responsible development of quantum technologies? And there are several principles that are in there, and the sort of examples is like, okay, how good are we with what is this future? Are we taking into account the dual use of quantum technologies for good or for bad, right? That's dual use. It could be used to do bad things or do good things. Are we thinking about that? How there's this idea of a quantum race that's going on. And bringing back to the geopolitical parts. Not a space race, but it's a quantum race. Yeah, and that that one of the outcomes was actually that nowadays this is going quite well in the sense that we have international partners that are collaborating and it's all going well. But we see trends going on that with improved with legislation pushing for more sovereignty of superpowers, that actually this quantum race is not going on the quantum side, not going the right direction. If you think about the collaboration are ending slowly and sharing of technology is being limited. Yeah.
Is that in reference to like something like the last week's U.S. elections as well, or?
Well, I mean, I think it supersedes that a little bit because that's a process that's been going on for a decade almost, where quantum technologies are being more and more regulated, where it's harder to be able to buy any, even for us, right? Even for us to buy components, even though they're not even quantum components, but could be used in quantum purposes, get much harder to purchase those from, within Europe from other places. So everything gets pulled more into Europe, and the same thing happens in the US. And so, these trends we see going on, we slowly, it starts to drip into our work, right, a little bit. But on a geopolitical landscape, this is not changing. So this has been moving in the same direction the whole time.
One of the things I'd pick up from that actually is the kind of international body of regulations of this. Before we started working on this show, you came off writing a thesis in design, and that thesis was called Frequency of Frequency.
Spectrum of Spectrum.
Spectrum of Spectrum, sorry. Spectrum of Spectrum, which was about the frequency spectrum, which has lent its name to this event today. And one of the visits that you've done was to the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union in Geneva, that actually looks to regulate the spectrum broadbands, including setting up a task force for the potential quantum spectrum in the future. So I was wondering maybe coming off of what Kian is reflecting on and the kind of difficulty of even buying components, which is new to me. That's an interesting one. So in light of the kind of chip wars that are going on. I was wondering if you could let us in a little bit about how that informed the show, this kind of spectrum research.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of a speculative story. So indeed, I wrote my thesis on the spectrum of spectrum. I came across the spectrum allocation graph, which for those of you who have never seen it is a map, just as we have the map of the world, of our countries. This is a map of the air, more particularly of the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's like full of squares and colors and squares inside squares, and it's pretty ridiculous to think both of frequencies or the electrification of electromagnetic waves in this way, especially because it's not something that is static, more importantly, but also because these graphs were drawn in 1920 to 1930 with the Radio Allocation Act. And so back then also our technologies and tools were very different. And so instead of rethinking another kind of cartography, they've gone into adding squares into this one already existing. So the map really looks like a patchwork. And so then I inquired about this graph, and this is what led me to start. The only way to understand the graph for me was to understand physics and to understand what was the materiality that we are regulating here. So that's how I came into the electromagnetic spectrum, the physics, the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union, which is the first planetary organization that existed ever, even before the UN. So the UN has about 70-something years old. The ITU has over 150 years old. And so it was brought to existence by the need to regulate communications and avoid interference. For better, for war, or for peace, no noise. That is their sort of like one-liner. And so they, according to what they would say, is they don't interfere in politics, they're just a regulating body. Surprising enough, they can't regulate quantum because they regulate frequencies, and quantum is traveling on light. So they are somewhat having a very heated debate or discussions on what do we do now, like how is it then our regulation in place? Or is it? Or do we need to form a different kind of body for it? But this led me to understand that the technology already, the apparatuses, the devices that we have, are manufactured under the frequency that they have been allocated by this graph. So it also meant that some of the companies that are manufacturing the devices, or the devices that we have in our hands, have capabilities that are much broader than the ones that we are allowed by frequency allocation to use. So then I'm like, wow, then there's something here. How can we ditch the devices? Because if I wanted it to communicate at a long distance with somebody, but I always have to be mediated by a device, then conversations of censorship and politics come into play. And so I ended in telepathy.
So essentially what you're talking about is telepathy.
So very quickly in this hypertition, I like this dreaming, no? This exercise that you're talking about. Like, okay, what is a world that I could dream of that doesn't need devices? And so telepathy comes to the table for me, and I went deep into the history and of telepathy. Telepathy was being researched very, very thoroughly in the early 50s and 40s and all the way to the 70s. And in fact, in the USSR, it was called bioradio and biocommunication. And it was believed to be this like mind-to-mind communication potentiality in which devices wouldn't be necessary. And the way to explain some of the workings of telepathy, then the framework of quantum mechanics was incredibly appropriate for some of the reasons that, or some of the concepts that were spoken very here in the table today: superposition, entanglement, most importantly. So this led me to, this is how I arrived to quantum, really, and how I arrived to entanglement, thinking about telepathy and thinking about the gap, thinking about the way to ditch devices or to ditch the systems that are already such embracing such regulations. And a note that I would also want to perhaps bring, which has to do with language, no? Like, because here in the table you've been speaking about quantum supremacy, for example, and I do want to make a note on this specifically because in this imagination and in this exercise of the potential futures, how do we name the tools or the technologies of our future are also crafting a path for them. So for me, that I'm coming from a completely different non-scientific environment, to listen to words like decoherence, which is what you are trying to achieve in the lab, is kind of amazing. Like, whoa, we are thriving for coherency, not for being decoherent, or supremacy, which of course has incredible connotations when outside the lab. So same thing for uncertainty, but also time after heartbeat, which is a measurement that you take. No, like it's a specific point. And so these terminologies have a critical weight outside of the lab, and so for me, the same is the case for the very first work when you enter the gallery. That is a closed circuit that is a master-slave configuration, and the very reason why I made that work is because of the naming of that circuit, which in technology this is incredibly common, to name the master a device that has control over the slaves, which in fact are the secondary devices, but they're called slaves. And then another point that I would like to make here is like how language and culture are the primarily forces shaping reality, but matter is not passive, and it actively participates in shaping reality as well. So,
so what you were saying is that part of these terms that you've used are part of the phrase poems. I know are lifted from a paper you wrote, Kian, but what you're arguing, Agustina, is that they also set out, much like what Tom was arguing, they set out the kind of imaginary we have for the technology, and they set out a path for how they will operate within society.
Absolutely, yeah. And what is then the responsibility of these namings, and how is it that the language that we have is not enough? Do we have to then create another kind of naming? I mean, it's a proposition also to think about the language, but also not to, again, what I was saying just now, not to also just place all the responsibility in language, because matter, as in materiality, also participates actively in the construction of our reality. So it's not only led to language, but also to materiality. And how then we shape our human meaning, in the creation and the evolution of the world that we want.
Yeah, I'm really hearing some shared themes among you. Regulation also strongly came back for you, Agustina, as it did for Ramon. I'm also aware of time. I could do this all day, and I really hope to continue doing this at least for today. But unlike anything we've done before, I'd like to end maybe with a rather quick fire round on what are these, different tempo immediately. On what are in these sort of immediate computer futures. And maybe I'll start with where it all started for us, which was in the lab, I suppose. And Maria Grazia, what might your work look like in 5 years, if we're talking about the 60-year span?
Yes, it's a really nice question because we were discussing that before. So recently, what we achieved in the lab, besides the metropolitan entanglement, we also achieved the first quantum operating system, which, like, it sounds something like, okay, what this mean? Okay, besides the hardware and the platform that we could use for making entanglement and making quantum communication something doable, we also need to think a bit who's going to use this and how a user is going to use the technology. And therefore, we started joining forces also, for example, with computer scientists and system engineers. And we came up with what we call a stack, where we have a user interface where a user can decide what kind of application or how how they want to use the platform. And their application then is somehow abstracted in such a way that then will reach our platform, and then the application will be executed. But I think this probably was the first time that in our lab we started thinking of, okay, how can we approach a more general public? Usually when people come to see my lab, I always ask the question, do you know how to program a code, how to program an application? And people usually say, not really, they don't know. But so at the moment, this technology is there. One can use it, but it's still not made in such a way that let's say, a general person from society can actually benefit from that. So going back to the question, I think in 5 years, a lot still has to do to make this more approachable to the general public. And I think that indeed research will push a lot into that. But at the same time, what we have to ask ourselves is, do we really need that? Do, let's say, ordinary people, do they really need to use this? Do they really need quantum computers? Do they really need to make this very complicated and power consuming operations? So indeed, I think, as has been said a lot at this table, that in 5 years, these answers would be more clear, and I think also research will be shaped in such a way that can really go to the target, because I think at the moment it's a bit broad, like we're going towards every direction, try to find a way, try to find the best platform, try to find best way to control this platform. So 5 years probably we will narrow down to make it something more useful.
So the work of narrowing down, but also actually outreach and accessibility is what I hear you say. Yeah.
Yes, because I mean it's a kind of a funny story. Like when I was working at this experiment, I was at home a bit sick actually, but research doesn't stop. And then I was there running this experiment using this stack, and I was actually thinking like, okay, who's gonna use this, and how can I help people to understand and say, oh yes, I also want that, I also want to use that. And what I thought is that what is lacking at the moment is a way to communicate to people that, for example, they don't have to be scared of these technologies, or they don't need to be overhyped about that, but rather like there should be a sort of more education, I would say. Like, this is not rocket science, let's say, but maybe like outreach should invest more in educating people in like, you don't need to be a physicist for that. I think this kind of knowledge can be accessible to everyone, but indeed also science communication should address the problem of educating society. And
taking that to Tom, because you are a little bit in that cross-disciplinary position. What does that trade in computer futures, as you called it before in our conversation, look like for you in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for sure it involves some of the stuff that I think we've all talked about, which is thinking about the way in which we imagine this future and so on. But I think what's also important, because we're still hearing, like you said earlier on the news, this idea, like a news article that says quantum computing is this magic that will solve such a problem, climate change, or you told me this story about the cow as well, and all this sort of stuff. But so I think, of course, it's important to think about how we develop these things, but also I think a really important question to ask is, well, how do we solve the problems if the technology doesn't exist, or if it doesn't come around in 5 years or 10 years? And thinking about, well, what are the ways that we address that? So, of course, these are mostly things about politics to some extent, but also, I mean, I'm struck a little bit by Agustina, you were saying about matter having a role in the world, and Ramon, earlier on when you were talking about, you described this thing of interference and difference between the kind of self and other, and this kind of superposition. And it strikes me that actually that's kind of how I think about the way the artwork produces knowledge in the world, which is this kind of object, this material thing that produces meaning or produces something through its kind of interference with another, and it's really about the interference of multiple subjectivities. So to some extent as well, it's really about thinking not only how do we solve the problem if it doesn't exist, but also what are the sort of knowledges we need to do that, and part of that also, we were speaking earlier on about, Agustina, you mentioned having to learn algebra to be part of this project, and the kind of need to learn very technical languages, which of course is very useful to have these conversations, but also does represent, I suppose, a sort of epistemic injustice that exists, in which to kind of have conversations about things like quantum computing, we have to learn very technical languages. And actually, as you're saying, Maria Grazia, that it's responsibility of all of us to actually learn kind of common languages that we can use to kind of talk about these technologies. And so that's maybe the thing that certainly I would like to see in the next 5 years, but
Work on evolving a common language. Yeah. Maybe just to Ramon and Agustina, and then I'm really wrapping it up. Open bar, let's go.
I'll try to be short here, but I think the thing that I sort of imagine is an imagination that doesn't have to be attached to utility. Yep. And in doing so, an imagination that can just flourish without having to function as something, right? Because we're also talking about a phenomenon that functions in the world without necessarily a utility. It just is. And that sort of leads me to, this kind of hope and dream that I have is that, I do believe in one sense, we need to have more public education about how these things work. It needs to be accessible. But I think we're also missing a key opportunity. And so I imagine a world where the scientific community in the lab actually becomes the radical act of change itself, and not outsourcing that outside of the lab. Because this has happened so many times. At the emergence of statistics in the 17th century, we had the same conversation. Statistics is going to change the world. All of a sudden, the statisticians went from imagination to being utility. Do it for this government purpose. This happened at the emergence of machine learning in the 1950s before it split with AI, exact same situation. Here's a space where we can imagine all of a sudden all of the labs shifted their operation from imagination to utility. This must do email, right? We see that with the emergence of AI. So in a way, I guess what I'm promoting is that we already know what's going to happen in 5 years. because it's already happened. It keeps happening, and it will happen after quantum. And what I think is that quantum actually gives us another path, because it teaches us that an infinite amount of possibilities are already contained within a single moment. And so I imagine more scientific-led communities understanding that the path that they're going down is a path that had already been determined, and we're not going to talk our way out of it, and we're definitely not going to have a focus group and a workshop to get us out of it. We're actually need to actually take another path. So if we're going to take quantum seriously, then why don't we meet with quantum where it is instead of forcing quantum to meet us where we are? And if we meet quantum where it is, then what I imagine is that our scientific communities can really flourish within the expertise that they have, but also understand that they're functioning in something that might be against societal principles, and you don't need to look outside of a lab to see societal principles. I think Audre Lorde, I think it was Audre Lorde that already said that, you know, in this circle of clothes, you know, the outside is already in. And I doubt, you know, as an engineer myself, and I can't imagine you walk into a lab and you just become a completely new person. And then you walk out, what's the Apple show, Severance? Right, you know, you just completely walk out, and all of a sudden this pure, you know, space exists. So you know, what I imagine is that these conversations about ethics or how it needs to be used or what's good for society actually gets driven by those that are actually proponents of this. And really learning the lessons of what we've seen with this emergence of AI, right? Because it's quite fantastic the amount of people that accelerated this technology that are now standing back, like it wasn't me, right? And, you know, and I'm thinking in that sense, it's not for us to demonize certain communities, but actually to say we have different proximities to these technologies. And so instead of outsourcing that, so my grandmother learns quantum, why can't the quantum scientists actually change the world? That's what I envision in 5 years. Yeah.
I think that's a really rather hopeful note to end on. Augustina, thank you so much for the enormous amount of work that's gone into the show, and also let the work speak for itself. So if you haven't seen the show yet, it's open now, and it will be open until the 15th of December. Thank you so much to Ramon, Tom, and Maria Grazia and Kian, not just for coming here, but to you two also, all the work that you've done with us in preparing for this show. And there's like really some takeaways that I take from today, this idea of all politics is regulation, with whom and for whom are we telling the stories of new technologies, but especially the imagination that's not attached to utility. So should we all be quantum scientists, or should all quantum scientists kind of set out to change the world in a different way than we've seen it before? So thank you very much. Please give it up for everyone, and see you at the bar.
Good work.
Oh, sorry, that was like Ben, my